Good morning, everybody. My name is Shiloh Williams, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about something that I've been thinking about for a lot over the last year. I've been thinking about how researchers and artists approach data practices and how their methods differ depending on whether they're inside or outside the academy. A little bit of context about myself and some of the training I've received that undoubtedly informed my thinking. Is that most of my career has been spent in academic libraries, working as a data librarian. I received my Master's of Library Information Science from University of California, Los Angeles, and have worked for public research university libraries ever since then, mostly within the realms of research data management and data ethics. So I've been thinking about the specific concepts in this talk for over a year now, and just thinking a lot about them. So I'm very excited to actually get to talk about some of them. So I want to begin with a quick rundown of some of the different types of data practices that I'll be discussing today. These aren't hard and fast categories, but there are ways. But there are ways that I've sorted them that make the most sense to me and that have reflected my own experience working with data. The first is traditional data practices. These are data practices that we typically think of when we think about data. Data maybe from the sciences, social sciences, and medicine. Typically, this data is prepared in standardized ways. So it's formatted to allow for computational analysis. This is data that doesn't typically need to make an argument for its own existence. Although depending on the data's topic, that might not be true. I can think of plenty of data sets that are in these fields, and people might question why we need to have them. So it's not always true. But we can think about this in general as being data that isn't questioned about why it's data and not something else. The second would be emerging data practices. These are typically found in fields that are less associated with digital analysis, including humanities and the arts. So these are disciplines that produce data, but it's not the primary form of research output or even the most expected form of research output. This is data that is typically questioned about why it's data and not something else. How many times have digital humanists heard that their methods dilute their sources or that their methods make their sources less true? The third is going to be the focal point of this presentation, which are alternative practices. So data in this category can be described as occasional, autobiographical, or maybe sometimes personal. This is data that's typically collected or created outside the academy. It's not funded and there is no position associated with it, and oftentimes no prestige. It may be regarded as having less value, truth, or relevance than data collected in more traditional ways, although I would argue it's a bit undeserving of that association. I think that alternative data practices can produce data that is just as valuable, truthful, and relevant as data collected in more traditional ways, if not more. So part of this follows to a question that I previously alluded to, which is it data? Why is this data and not something else, like art, a book, a list of errands? To this, I would first say that I'm trained in information studies, as I mentioned before, and I've adopted a sort of inclusive definition of what data is. So to me, data really just signifies information. Part of the term also to me implies having an actionable quality. So something being data, to me at least, it implies that you can do something with it, that you can draw an insight from it, or you can create change with it, or that a collection of data can reveal something. In their book, Data Feminism, Lauren F. Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio describe a similar sort of approach to data. And their definition of data science really comes down to this quote, which says, many people think of data as numbers alone, but data can also consist of words or stories, colors or sounds, or any type of information that is systematically collected, organized, and analyzed. the science in data science simply applies a commitment to systematic methods of observation and experiment. So that's from their book, Data Feminism from MIT Press. And this view of data that they also extend to data science is really notable because it falls into data science being a male-dominated field both in and outside the academy, and it speaks to some of the ways that that notion can be complicated. As to why it is data and not something else, I would say, why shouldn't it be data? Why? I guess what is prompting this more exclusive view of data? In my perception, I think that an inclusive approach like Klein and D'Ignazios is a warranted one. So in thinking about this, humanities scholars can also help to illuminate this. So I'm thinking specifically of a couple of researchers that I have come to, I've come to their writings to learn more about this and to learn more about autobiography studies. So one of them is Nancy K. Miller, who is a literary theorist. She describes the concept of occasional writing, which she describes as writing in a marginal time frame, instead of a more established mode of theorizing. She also describes occasional writing as a deconsidered genre, basically meaning that it's a domain that is not unnoticed, but it's actually disregarded, something to avoid taking too seriously. This could easily apply to data practices, especially non-typical visualization methods such as textile art, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. Also important here is Lauren Fournier's work on auto theory and her arguments for auto theory and autobiography as feminist practices that exist in a space separate from the typical offices of tenured faculty. These sort of offices of tenured faculty, as we might imagine them, would fall into Miller's definition of sort of more established modes of theorizing. Here, Miller is talking more about people who work in the academy, who have access to resources and who can gain material benefit from thinking and from writing. However, traditional and alternative data practices intersect in some important ways. I want to say that both involve the recording of observations or information in an organized and structured way. They also both employ various types of analysis, both computational and not. I want to note here that where they diverge, where these two data practices or types of data practices really differ, it's not really substance, but it is context. So while traditional data practices involve speaking within disciplinary norms, so do alternative methods. It's just that the discipline or the crowd, that's really what differs. Alternative data practices make use of vernacular and vocabulary to make meaning from and organize their data, but the vernacular is typically associated with the personal or the home sphere instead of the so-called intellectual or academic sphere, which are seen sometimes to be different. Alternative practices also oftentimes take place after or between hours rather than being a dedicated part of professional life as they are in academia. So as a librarian might say, the difference here is not in the formal contents, but rather in the descriptive ones. It's really just, in my reading of it, that traditional data practices tend to speak to already established disciplines that tend to be more highly respected, while alternative data practices tend to be associated more with what we might call, or what some people might call women's work. And so they get unfairly sort of seen as being less serious than traditional data practices when the differences are not so great in terms of form. So this is one example of a data visualization that was created through alternative methods. This is a really great piece by India Johnson, who chronicled the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic using ink and fabric. Johnson recorded the results of daily case counts in Johnson County, Iowa, by stamping fabric with the phrase "from plague deliver us." This practice created both an affective and an empathic response in Johnson, who recounted the pain of placing each stamp. So this is the kind of visualization that seems to be more personal. It was created by hand. We can see also that not only was it stamped by hand, but it was actually both pieced by hand and machine. So there was this sort of tactile experience of creation here that inspired this response in the artist. The same kind of data was recounted by counties across the United States, usually in health departments, but usually recounted in charts or dashboards, sometimes compiled by programs like R. So that's one thing that struck me about seeing this is just, this is the same data that we might look at maybe for the Johnson County Health Department page, but seeing it in this different form, why is this maybe regarded differently? I think it's a great piece. So I also want to say that Shannon Mattern has noted that technologies for personal writing can be found in furnishings themselves, including the escritoire. Escritoires, as pictured to the left, this desk, they were found to contain numerous hidden departments, and they were typically used by women to draft personal writing or correspondence, which could then be hidden or protected by these areas in the desk that were hidden from ordinary viewers, maybe people who weren't as familiar with working with the desk. This really struck me as I was reading through my notes on this talk. I was wondering, what kind of similar technologies might exist for data. Does textile visualization function in a similar way? Are there similar sort of ways in which visualizing data through this maybe quote unquote women's work might function in a similar way to a woman doing personal writing on an escritoire? That was one thing that I thought of, is that we can envision this type of personal writing as an alternative data practice. So sort of broadening also that idea of data practice. So some final notes before closing, because we're getting to the end. I want to note here that alternative here does not necessarily mean untrained. Many alternative data practitioners are trained in the academy, and aside from that, it's pretty condescending to tell people that non-academic training is unimportant. Non-academic training is really important. There's a number of ways that people can be trained to do this kind of data work, including learning textile art, as we've seen earlier. So as feminists, we should acknowledge all forms of labor and definitely acknowledge the expertise of people creating these visualizations. I want to also note that occasional here, it really means of an occasion, rather than, it doesn't really denote frequency. So saying occasional writing doesn't really mean that somebody does it infrequently. It more means that they do it on the occasion that they're able to. Finally, I wanted to note that the data in these practices may be analog or it may be digital. I've used a few different analog examples here, but it can be either one. So thank you all for coming today. I really enjoyed speaking, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.